Hi, everybody. This lecture is on the apology, the defense of Socrates. And before we get into the actual story, just a little brief history about ancient Greece and kind of the beginnings of Western philosophy or Western philosophical thought. Um, Back in 400 BCE, roughly, we see Athenian democracy really taking root, and this war that occurs in Greece that kind of divides Greece up into different nation states, where each particular state is its own little democracy. So there's no real kind of nationality unifying these different states like you'd see in the United States. Instead, each is this kind of independent state. And within these different independent states, there was groups of people known as sophists, and these sophists were the educated group, and they would go around to different towns within the different states and teaching people. And they taught for money, basically kind of traveling tutors, and they were masters in rhetoric. And for the sophists, truth was something that was relative because they saw this kind of difference between the different city states of Greece and how that kind of dictatorial rule prior to the Athenian democracy was more of a kind of absolutist way of thinking. And so when that sort of crumbled, the sophists kind of took that as a crumbling of this idea that truth was something that was objective. And so instead, truth for them was something relative. And that's going to be something important as we move on through this course and as we look at different writings of Plato and these stories of Socrates, which we're talking about today. So the two main characters that we're focusing on today in Western philosophy in general is Socrates and Plato. Now, Socrates didn't write a lot. We actually have nothing from him in terms of written material. Everything that we have from Socrates is taken from his student Plato. And so Plato writes these dialogues where Socrates is the main character and is broken up really into kind of three eras. The early era where a lot of Plato's philosophy seems to be more in line with what Socrates believed, and then sort of a transitioning era from Socrates to then the latter era of Plato's own independent work. So with the story of the Apology, it's essentially the story of Socrates' trial. Socrates was tried for crimes against the state, for corrupting the youth, and not believing in the gods that Athenians believed in. And this story goes about explaining his trial and then aftermath, his death. And so Socrates is guilty of being a busybody. So the quote is that Socrates is guilty of being a busybody, and then he inquires into what is beneath the earth and the sky, turns the weaker argument into the stronger, and teaches others to do the same. So this kind of comes from a comedy by Aristophanes, but it represents the charges levied against Socrates. Socrates was an individual who would go around to the markets, inquiring from patrons of the market into what is justice or what is love or what is all these different things, beauty. And when they gave him an answer, he would kind of utilize the Socratic method of kind of questioning their answer and finding these loopholes, this kind of back and forth conversation, and end up getting them to either contradict themselves or eventually agree with, or eventually just disagree with the position that they ultimately held in the beginning. And so when we look back and think of this type of person, he seems kind of annoying. He seems like he is challenging the status quo of what other people think. And this is not good for those that are in power. And it's also not good for the sophists who went around teaching people things for a fee. Because here you would have Socrates questioning these sophists and end up getting them to contradict themselves so that people would see that they really don't know all the things that they say they know. And this is bad for business, right? And so Socrates had a lot of enemies. And so the formal charge is that Socrates is guilty of corrupting the young, and he's corrupting the young by essentially having these back and forth dialogues with sophists, and the young students around him seeing how he bested them in an argument, essentially. And in addition to this, he also questions ideas of God and was charged with failing to acknowledge the gods of the city. So the story goes, Socrates was in conversation with a friend whose uncle, I'm sorry, in a conversation with his friend's cousin, right? Doesn't really matter, but it kind of sounds funny. It's his friend's cousin's dog's owner's brother, right? So Socrates is in this conversation, and his friend said that his cousin went to the oracle at Delphi, and the oracle told him that there is no man wiser than Socrates. And so when this was relayed to Socrates, Socrates thought to himself, like, oh, that's weird because I don't really know much about anything. And so he set out on this task to go finding out what he could from these different sophists, from the educated people in society. And so he believed this response of the oracle to be some sort of riddle that he had to somehow come up with an answer for or try to disprove. And so he spoke to all of these different sophists, and it became abundantly clear to Socrates that he, in fact, was wiser than these sophists, because what Socrates knew was that he didn't really know anything. Meanwhile, the sophists believed that they knew all of these different things about justice, beauty, and knowledge and reality. And so while they knew nothing because all of these arguments for these things like beauty and justice were incorrect or somehow led to contradictory reason, Socrates essentially knew at least one thing, that he didn't really know any of this stuff. And so by questioning these people, he began creating these enemies, started having people go against him, and corrupting the youth, as it were. And when we look at this kind of charge against Socrates, it seems a bit weird because he seems to reason that it's not the majority that helps the children, it's the majority that harms them. And he uses the analogy of a horse trainer, right? Only a horse trainer knows how to train a horse. Other people don't know how to train a horse, so their attempts at trying to train a horse would actually be counterproductive to that horse. Same thing with society. And so if he is in fact the one that is harming society, while everybody else is doing good, this would seem contrary to any type of analogy of educating or training, when usually it's the few that train, the masses that don't. While his accusers here are suggesting that he himself is the only one corrupting the youth, and he thinks that this is backwards. And it seems to reason that if he's doing so, if he is harming them, then he must be doing so unintentionally. Because if he was harming them intentionally, the reasoning went that harming someone close to you intentionally is just going to come back to bite you in the ass later. So no one would knowingly hurt someone close to them, knowing that will blow back on them. Instead, you would have to be harming them unintentionally. And if he was harming them unintentionally, then he shouldn't be tried and convicted and punished capitally, right? He shouldn't have his life taken or be thrown in prison. Instead, the punishment for inadvertently corrupting the youth would be some sort of private instruction or teaching or something to get him to stop doing that, right? Some sort of class that would help him understand what he's doing wrong and how to stop that. And then the second case levied against him was that he wasn't worshiping the gods. And this also seems a bit far-fetched because Socrates is only in this mess because of the oracle at Delphi. So he himself is seeking out and listening to the gods that the rest of society holds dear and believes. So Socrates thinks that this accusation is not one that holds water. Socrates does, in fact, accept spiritual beings, so he has to expect divine ones, right? Accept divine ones, right? We can't accept music without a musician. We can't expect architecture without the architect. And so if Socrates accepts these spiritual beings like the oracle, then he would have to accept the divine ones as well. And so what's happening in this story is that those who don't like Socrates is essentially just levying this case against him in order to get him thrown in jail or killed because he is proving to be a nuisance and is kind of shaking up the status quo of society. And so this is where we kind of get a defense of philosophy and what philosophy is about. Socrates considers himself to be like the gadfly, the fly that would fly around a horse's face. And so these flies agitate society or agitate the horse so that the horse will get up and walk around. If the horse didn't have these flies flying around, he would just lay down and kind of be an unhealthy horse, wouldn't get the exercise that he needs. This is essentially Socrates' role. Socrates is there to question society for what it is that society is doing, how we're existing in this world. And it's people like Socrates that we need, just like the horse needs the gadfly. And so when it comes to philosophy, our goal is to try to understand the world better. We're trying to get clear on our definitions and our understanding of concepts and phenomenon. And so philosophy is a very important discipline when it comes to having society work or business work or really anything. This idea that we need to continually test and question and make better these types of little organizations. So for Socrates, he really defends this search for wisdom. He claims that an unexamined life is no life for a human being to live. So a life in which you don't question your reality, a life in which you don't question your purpose is not a life worth living, essentially. And if the examined life results in death, maybe we might think it's not worth examining life. But Socrates, on the other hand, said, no, it's still worth it. Trying to understand your place and your purpose, trying to question the authorities that be, is all part of how we live a life. And so after Socrates is convicted of these crimes, right, because even though he seems to accurately and convincingly defend himself to the reader, he has so many enemies in Athens that he is convicted on these charges and sentenced to death. And for Socrates, he says, I suspect that what has befallen me is a blessing, and that those of us who suppose death to be an evil cannot be making a correct assumption. So even something as important and inevitable as death is not something that Socrates fears. And he doesn't fear death for two reasons. Either when you die, you go into this dreamless sleep where nothing exists, there's no thought, there's no soul, right? Take the most atheistic position you can imagine. And death is like you die and then you would never know it, right? It's just a deep sleep. And so if you would never know it, like, you can't be scared or mad or angry because when you die, it's over. Or if there does happen to be something else that occurs, then this would in fact be a blessing because now Socrates is able to inquire more and learn more. So even if he goes to hell, or if he goes to heaven, or if he has a seat next to Apollo, right, in the clouds, either way, he would be learning more about the world. And that in itself is part of this life and process that we live. So for Socrates, death was not something to fear because we didn't really know what death was. Instead, it's either a dreamless sleep or we get to learn more. And for Socrates, learning more, that examined life, was the ultimate bliss. So both of these instances kind of creates this blessing. So he's not afraid to really die. Instead, he willingly drinks the poison that will kill him. So, in terms of the limits of our understanding, if you don't know something, then you shouldn't think that you do. Or, like Socrates says, if I don't know something, I do not think that I do, right? Meaning that the only thing I know is that I don't know stuff, right? Just because we have an idea of what something is, the more we really try to understand it, the more complicated it becomes. You might think to yourself about an idea like justice, for instance. We all talk about justice. We all see acts that require just behavior in the news and the media. But when we really look to what it means to be just, uh, it doesn't seem to be as clear as when we looked at it broadly. And so for Socrates, wisdom really requires that we're able to recognize the limits of our understanding, to not claim that we know things when we don't know things, right? There's a difference between truth and beliefs. And most of the things that we come across on a daily basis are more attuned to beliefs rather than knowledge or truth. And we only have to look around briefly to see that this is the case when we use words like love or justice or beauty. These things are not easily identifiable, not easily defined or understood. It's even just talking about them becomes uncomfortable when you really start to think what it means and how it relates to different people and so forth. Now, with this being the case, we might think to ourselves that there are certain objections that we can take to Plato's dialogue with Socrates. First, this idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. Maybe some of you might think that it is, right? Maybe if we take um, the position against Bertrand Russell's work in ignorance is bliss, right? Maybe we just want to be happy and not think about stuff. I know all the times that I watch the news, it makes me depressed. So then I'll turn it off and not watch it for a couple weeks, and I'm happy. I don't have to see all the terrible things that are happening with the world, and it feels kind of good. But Socrates believes that this is something that's fleeting, and that eventually, right, we do need to examine life. We do need to kind of try to understand things because eventually it will be something that kind of comes back to bite us. Perhaps death isn't a blessing, right? Maybe if Socrates actually did go to hell and he thought to himself, oh, well, this is great. There's this new dimension of reality. I'm so excited. But then the second he starts getting tortured, he thinks to himself, like, oh shit, this is not good anymore. I don't like this, right? So perhaps death isn't necessarily a blessing. And so throughout this course, one of the things that we're going to try and do, and the way that we're going to try and tackle a lot of these ideas that we talk about, is to really try and understand them first and then come up with certain objections. for everything that we talk about, there are going to be objectionable um, ideas. These ideas that we're looking at are not things that are absolute truth. We're going to be talking about how to behave, how to whether or not we should provide animal rights. We're going to look at abortion and the existence of God. These are not readily answered topics. And so, in addition to understanding the arguments for a certain position, we're also going to look at objections. And this is really what philosophy is about, right? It's about shaking up our ideas to really try and refine and clarify what things are so that we can understand the world better. Because the more that we're able to understand the world, the easier it will be to live in it. So when we look at these couple main objections, we think to ourselves, well, yeah, I mean, Socrates' claim that the Socrates' claim that life isn't worth living if it's unexamined. However, this doesn't actually correlate to other analogous examples. I might think to myself that surfing is fun. Um, Other people don't think so, but I'm kind of speaking for myself, and I think it's fun. So if other people would disagree with my assertion that surfing is fun, why wouldn't we necessarily be able to disagree with Socrates' assertion that an unexamined life is one not worth living? Again, if I can remain ignorantly blissful for my entire life, that kind of seems pretty cool. Um, Others may not like it, but some might. Some might want to be in the dark and not like to see the different tragedies that are existing in the world or think of their own mortality. So perhaps we might think that this particular assertion by Socrates uh, isn't one that's actually true. Others of you might think to yourself, well, no, this does seem a bit right. Even though I claim that I want to be ignorantly blissful, there will become a time where on my deathbed I will have to deal with certain these things, in which case it will be more traumatizing to me if I haven't been able to think about it prior or really come to terms with it versus someone who has contemplated death and kind of accepted the end to their life. Or what about the claim that you wouldn't knowingly do wrong to individuals who are close to you, and that this will come back to bite you in the butt? Well, this again might not be the case. I might think that I want to get close to my coworkers and then essentially screw them over so that I can get promotions or so that I can make more money or whatever. And it's not always clear that these things will come back to bite us. They might, and they might if we do something maybe legally wrong or um, morally wrong. But again, even that's not the case. There's plenty of people who do things that are morally wrong or illegal that the law just never catches up to them and they end up dying, going out on top kind of thing. So the claim that Socrates is making um, may be pretty objectionable. Again, it just kind of depends on how you relate to it in terms of the justification for his position. And we want to hold Socrates to a standard that we hold ourselves. We want to make sure that he's justifying his claims just like we justify ours. So when you express something in a paper or when you express an answer on your final or midterm, that you are doing so clearly and concisely and then using justification and examples to prove your point. And then lastly, again, right, this idea of fearing death. Um, Socrates claims that death is like one of these two things, either a deepless sleep or you end up living with the gods and knowing about life thereafter. But this seems to really commit the false dichotomy fallacy where you create two exhaustive options that really aren't the case. Socrates is obviously giving us two particular options that can happen when you die, but nobody really knows what happens. So to claim that there are only two options isn't really legitimate here. Um, Perhaps there are other options available that we haven't considered or just can't even fathom. And so to believe that this is the case, again, is maybe a little problematic. So throughout the rest of this course, it's important that first you're understanding the material, then you're able to counter argue or support whatever it is that you are reading or listening to, because it's this type of critical thinking that is not only going to help you through the course, but it's going to help you in life when you have to solve problems or deal with coworkers or vote for particular people or propositions, right? We're going to have to use this critical thinking of understanding the position and then coming up with counter arguments to determine whether or not the position holds or doesn't.